So for this segment, I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Lesh, Country Director at Freshwater Strategy. Matthew, the Online Safety Act has been enforced, or at least its age verification regime has been enforced for about 2 weeks now. And already we're seeing that it's gone well beyond censoring what you could call adult content. What kind of things have you seen that's been censored?
Look, we've seen as a result of the Choosing Act, not just related to pornography, which is something that was, I guess, broadly understood, but because of this requirement to remove material that could be considered psychologically harmful to children, a broad swathes of material. And this is very much within the intent of the Act. It's only within the intent, if you read Ofcom's guidance, remove anything that could be considered, let's say, violent material. So we've seen a lot of material removed related to some, you could say horrific, but educational material when it comes to the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. We've seen Katie Lamb, a Tory MP, her speech about the rape gangs from, in fact, I think she was quoting from the court transcripts. We've seen that removed. And your listeners who use X or Twitter, as some of us still like to call it, will have seen a whole swathes of material that they now just says, due to laws in your country, this material has been hidden until we estimate your age. And very much some of the perspective of this has been, it's bugging up. Something's gone wrong here. The Act, there's been this weird response. If you go back to it, this is exactly as intended. This is exactly what the Act and Ofcom expects of these companies, even if they're perhaps now denying it.
Yeah, and because actually the fines levied on the companies are so extraordinary. I mean, people might not like the big tech companies, but when they're threatened with fines as large as millions of pounds, potentially huge chunks of their revenue, they're going to censor first, ask questions later, aren't they?
Well, indeed. So you've got fines up to 10% of global revenues for a big tech company. That's billions of pounds of fines. This is the whole incentive structure built into the Act. It says you've got this extensive set of safety duties, this expectation that they're going to prevent you from accessing certain types of content, and if they fail in those duties, if they first of all, there's some related to potentially even criminal sanctions and jail time if they're unresponsive to Ofcom, they don't do as Ofcom tells them to do. If they fail to meet some of the content-related duties, you're looking at billions of pounds in fines. So of course the incentive is act in a conservative way, remove lots of content. Now, whatever you think of Elon, he's generally tried to be oppositional to government diktats to remove content. But in this case, I think X has acted in the most prudent, legally justifiable way, which is to hide a lot of content from British users that might be considered to be harmful to children, despite the fact that it's obviously education, despite the fact that it is of democratic importance, despite the fact that in the not too distant future, 16 and 17-year-olds are meant to be able to vote. So there's a whole irony here, which is we're telling these 16 and 17-year-olds that you shouldn't have access to this material, in which you might want to be making your decision as in the democracy. And
the restrictions we're seeing, this is only under phase 2 of the implementation of the Act, and there are many more phases to come. So, Matthew, could you tell us a bit of what horrors await us from the Online Safety Act?
Well, look, there's all sorts of different points here. I think something that's not particularly understood even by advocates of the Act is the extent to which it does require quite expansive removals for adults. So the first issue with the Act, which we're now seeing quite prominently because it's quite obvious because it's age estimation issue, is for those who are unwilling to put forward their identity, they lose access to information. Now, Freshwater did a recent poll on this where we asked how you're going to respond to age gating. About 1 in 4 people said they would exit the website. So that's 1 in 4 people you've now said you can't access that information.
Yeah.
Now, even if the other remaining 75%, or less than that, who are going to ultimately comply, but who are going to have access to information, are probably going to have access to a more censored version of the internet. And that's because the duties that relate to illegal content are very widely drawn.
Right.
The way the Act expects companies to remove illegal content is on the basis of anything they reasonably likely to infer could be illegal. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyers I speak to say that is a hogwash. That is not a legal standard. We have the normal legal standards. If you do something illegal beyond reasonable doubt, if you do something in civil law on the balance of probabilities, have reasonably likely to infer anything could be illegal, should be removed from the platforms. We add on top of that the fact that there's these priority offences. So some of the priority offences actually relate to the UK's hate speech laws that we have concerns from a free speech perspective, like in the Lucy Conley case, of going too far in the way they're being used in the criminal courts. Now, applying that principle to the digital realm at the threshold of have reasonably likely to infer could be illegal, you're actually asking for a lot of material to be censored from these social media platforms, automatically at speed using AI systems. That's the only way you can actually expect it to comply with the Act. So I think we at a base level, we're just going to see a lot more censorship of digital platforms in order to comply with these laws. That is the first big implications, even once you get past the age estimation issue.
So that's even when you've put in your ID, you've done everything that's asked of you to prove your age, you're still going to get a kid's version of the internet, essentially.
Some versions, certainly some more censored version of the internet. So when it comes to social media websites, I mean, there's a bit of an inconsistency here in this Act, of course, because it doesn't apply to news media. It doesn't apply to, if you use a parliamentary website, you can still access a speech from Hansard. It seems very much if you want to be using social media, that's where the danger is. But if you access material in other places, you might still be able to get to it. I mean, there is this case I've just seen, and look, I don't want to go into the details of it, but where there seems to be an allegation that Tommy Robinson shared something that was on a news media website, and he's being prosecuted on the Online Safety Act, some of the criminal provisions of the Online Safety Act that are exempted from news media providers, but are not exempt if you're a user posting on social media.
Right.
So there's a whole different set of expectations if you're not news media when it comes to the digital world, where you're probably safe. I think the interesting parts of this Act that are going to come forward over time. I mean, there's lots of different places you can look at. One will be related to Secretary of State powers, where they have all these kind of powers to direct Ofcom to tell them what to focus on. There are these kind of emergency built-in powers. So if there is some kind of, let's say, another pandemic or another a very heavily contested election, the Secretary of State can direct Ofcom to put pressure onto the tech companies to be more censorious in the way they implement their policies. I mean, that's the practical implications of this. So I think that there's a lot of room there for political intervention, and we should consider both the Secretary of State themselves as well as Ofcom as political actors. They're going to be responding in the way that they open investigations, in who they're choosing to look at, what issues they're focused on, based upon the kind of broader media and political incentives. So if there is a kind of a panic about a certain issue or a certain problem or a certain question, I can't even imagine what it'll be today, but there will be more controversy in the future where Ofcom is just going to be constantly pushed to intervene and put pressure on social media companies. Another big one, which was a big part of the debate towards the end of the legislation passing, but hasn't really come up since, which is this question about private messaging.
Yes, I was going to ask you about.
Which is that there's provisions within the bill, both the fact that the bill itself applies all these duties to any social media platform, it doesn't exclude messaging platforms. So in a sense, the kind of content duties relate to the messaging platforms. Now, right now, they're not going to, at least a platform like WhatsApp or Messenger or whatever it may be, are going to opt not to be doing very much in intervening in our speech for now. But Ofcom has this provision within the Act that despite some concerns, significant concerns raised during the Act's passage, where they can force a WhatsApp, where they can force Messenger or Signal or Telegram, whatever it may be, to install some software for the purposes of preventing you from being able to share child sex exploitation material, which on the face of it sounds completely reasonable. The problem is, what you're asking for Ofcom to have the power to do, what Ofcom does have the power to do, and what they will be able to ask to do, is effectively end the existence of encryption when it comes to your messaging, because they would have to somehow check your messages against some kind of central database or some kind of centralized system. So the existence of end-to-end encrypted messages would effectively be over once the government's telling you to install some kind of spy software, even if for perfectly good reasons. But the fact they're telling you to install that spy software would mean that you no longer have an encrypted service. And WhatsApp have been quite clear, for example, saying that they would exit the UK market if the UK government asked them to start spying on their users in that way. So I think the fact that Ofcom still has that power, it's dormant for now, but it could be exercised in future and cause some quite serious problems in terms of not what we've previously been talking about, which is public communications, but these private platforms.
And finally, a lot of people will say, these are just teething problems, some of the things we're seeing. Can the bill be fixed in the name of, say, protecting children, which is not so much a free speech issue in and of itself? Or can it, is there no way of living with this bill without sacrificing free speech?
Yeah, look, I think at a fundamental level, despite some best efforts made by the government and even some ministers and sympathetic MPs and organisations who are trying to work on this debate to try to make it a bit more free speech friendly, at a fundamental level, the model in this Act is one of censorship. The so-called duty of care model is premised on the idea that platforms have to prevent you from saying things that will cause some kind of harm to other users, and structurally is set up to encourage extreme forms of censorship and removals of what I would consider to be legitimate speech. I don't think there's a way to fix that within this legislation. I think those who had concerns about the bill's passage in the first place, the only consistent response to that is to now be in favour of repealing this Act. And I don't have a good answer here in terms of how to protect children online. I don't think this Act will protect children online. And I think that it's going to create a false sense of security for parents. And one of the other interesting points we found when we were doing some recent freshwater polling was when you actually ask people, who do you think should be responsible? The answer is not tech companies. The answer is not government. It's about 60-70% of people will say it is the responsibility of parents and guardians.
Yeah.
And I think realistically speaking, that is the only way you take keeping a good eye on your child. Perhaps you can try to install some device level software and try to do parental controls on the device itself as more effective ways. Trying to use these big pieces of legislation to try to control information that can be accessed by everyone and not the solutions to child safety, but they will lead to mass censorship and therefore aren't the solution.
Matthew Lesh, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.